Well, Sheriff, what type of person is this man?
Well, we have reason to believe that he's a maniac. However, he is a cunning man. He knows just exactly what moves he's going to make. He knows where he's going to be from 1 minute to the next. He knows where he's going to start and when he's going to end. He plans these things out, and he knows just exactly how this thing is going to turn out. We think it appears to us that he is killing just for the thrill of killing.
Between December of 1968 and the following September, a menace plagued the San Francisco Bay Area. Emerging from the area of Vallejo, this unknown subject had struck on 4 separate occasions. The first attack, which came with no warning and no follow-up correspondence, happened in unincorporated Solona County and took the lives of teenagers David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen off of Lake Herman Road. The second assault, which took place nearly 7 months later, happened about 4 miles away in the city of Vallejo itself. Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau were each shot multiple times, and Darlene passed away on her way to the hospital. Later that month, a mysterious presence began to correspond with the area's newspapers, sending letters under the moniker of the Zodiac. This person took credit for the first 2 attacks, and began offering up cryptic ciphers and clues, which, they alleged, contained their identities. In September, the unknown attacker struck again, this time against another young couple relaxing along scenic Lake Berryessa, about an hour north of Vallejo in Napa County. The young couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were both able to provide police with information about the attack. However, just 2 days later, Cecilia Shepard passed away after falling into a coma. Brian Hartnell would survive. Intriguing information left at the crime scene, which later confirmed this as another perpetrated by this mysterious Zodiac, presented police with a conundrum. This killer seemed to be escalating in his frequency of attacking, constantly going after young couples in isolated areas. Just a couple of weeks later, though, the location and the victim profile of this madman changed. On October 11th, 1969, cab driver Paul Stine was shot and killed in a wealthy suburb of northern San Francisco, the victim of what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. The shot, which came from a passenger in the back seat of his taxi, was almost immediately fatal. Paul Stine perished at the scene, and the mysterious Zodiac claimed credit for the attack in a letter written to the San Francisco Chronicle. In that same letter, the Zodiac threatened to begin targeting school buses and the children inside of them, causing police in the area to begin ramping up their patrols as they waited for this unknown killer to strike again. Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Micheal Whelan. This episode is the third and final part of my take on the story of the infamous Zodiac Killer. If you like what you hear, make sure to head to iTunes or Apple Podcasts to rate and review the podcast. Those of you that already have, thank you so much for doing so. If you would like to take your support even further and help financially back the podcast, you can either head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod and get access to some cool bonus content. Or, if you'd rather make a one-time donation through PayPal, you could do so by hitting up our email address, which is theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. Now, without any further ado, let's head back in time to October of 1969, when the mysterious Zodiac has just taken credit for the most recent murder of Paul Stine, and is now escalating his threats to include school children. Paul Avery, a man who wrote crime columns for the San Francisco Chronicle, had been covering the Zodiac crimes for months at this point in 1969. On October 18th, he wrote a piece which seemed to take aim at the ego of the Zodiac himself. The opening line of the piece really pulls no punches. Quote, "The killer of 5 who calls himself Zodiac is a clumsy criminal, a liar, and possibly a latent homosexual." The article goes on to describe the Zodiac as a basic con man who takes credit for crimes he did not commit. It also critiques the many mistakes he made during the commission of his actual crimes, which include being seen by eyewitnesses, failing to kill those that could describe his voice and mannerisms, and, most recently, leaving behind a bloody fingerprint at the crime scene of Paul Stine's murder. Avery continued on his personal vendetta against the Zodiac himself in a series of paragraphs that took on the perceived fragility of the killer's ego. Quote, "It is the knife attack at Lake Berryessa that leads investigators to consider that Zodiac may be a latent homosexual. His cryptic writings and hand-lettered boast don't indicate this, but the way in which he wielded the knife does hint of it. The knife fell again and again and formed the mysterious symbol, like the crosshairs of a gun sight, that has come to be Zodiac's hallmark. Psychiatrists and criminologists have told investigators that such a modus operandi could mean Zodiac is unsure of his manhood." This thinking, that the killings were some kind of sexual release, seemed to be directly tied to the theories made about the motives of said killer. After all, these attacks made very little sense if there was no direct motive, and since any ties between the victims seemed tenuous at best. That was what both psychologists and criminologists could come up with at the time. Thomas C. Lynch, the Attorney General of California, was quoted in Paul Avery's article, and came across as much less combative than his journalistic counterpart. Quote, "We will see that he, the Zodiac, gets help and that all of his rights are protected. He is obviously an intelligent individual. He knows that eventually he will be taken into custody. So it would be best that he gives himself up before tragedy is written in blood." On October 22nd, a police department in Oakland, California, received a call. The call came in at around 2 o'clock in the morning and immediately raised alarms. The person at the other end of the phone claimed to be the Zodiac killer and demanded that noted Boston attorney F. Lee Bailey appear on a local television program. However, if Bailey could not make it, then another popular lawyer named Melvin Belli could fill in for him. F. Lee Bailey, who lived on the other side of the country, was an up-and-coming lawyer who had made waves for his handling of very important cases. Just a few years before, he had argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that his client, Sam Shepard, had been denied due process in his 1954 conviction for murdering his wife, later winning a not guilty verdict in a retrial. He had also played a part in the Boston Strangler case, and hosted a TV show for a spell in 1967. This is, of course, not mentioning the part he would play in future criminal proceedings, like the trial of Patty Hearst and O.J. Simpson, among others. However, because of both timing and geographical issues, namely being over 3,000 miles away, F. Lee Bailey was unable to make the program. Thus, the onus fell upon Melvin Belli, an older attorney that had a flair for the dramatic. Belli was known for being a flashy lawyer who had dubbed himself the King of Torts, after his success rate of filing and winning civil claims against corporations and individuals. He had become known in the area for firing a cannon on the roof of his Montgomery Street office whenever he won a tort settlement. He also hung a pirate flag on his office's flagpole. Belli had gained most of his acclaim for defending Jack Ruby in the murder trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, a case that he took on pro bono, simply for the publicity. After losing that trial, Melvin Belli's popularity had begun to wane, and many considered this entire ordeal a stunt, and that theory has not faded with time. Melvin Belli agreed to cooperate with law enforcement, and was escorted in the early morning hours to the production offices of KGO, San Francisco's ABC affiliate. That morning, October 22nd, 1969, Melvin Belli appeared on the KGO TV program AM San Francisco, sitting in along with host Jim Dunbar. The show had to push back an interview with a movie producer to accommodate this urgent matter, and 2 San Francisco detectives were present for the taping of the morning's broadcast. Early on in the program, Dunbar asked for anyone other than the Zodiac to refrain from calling in. Then, just moments later, the phone began ringing.
Talk to us. Just tell us what's going on inside you right now, Sam, please.
I have headache.
Right. How long have you had those headaches, Sam? In a long time?
Since I killed a kid.
Well, was it before December that you had the headaches?
Yes.
Were you in service that you might have had an injury in service? Did you ever fall out of a tree or downstairs? Were you ever unconscious?
I don't know.
You don't remember. Does aspirin do you any good?
No.
Doesn't do any good. Sam, that stuff never did me any good either when I had headaches. Sam, let me ask you a question. Did you attempt to call this program one other time when Mr. Belli was with us? And you
What?
Did you try to call us one other time about two or 3 weeks ago when Mel Belli was with us?
Yes.
And you couldn't get through? Couldn't get through? The phones were tied up? Was that it?
Yes.
Sam, let me ask you this. There's some reason why you go to a particular doctor or a particular priest, and some reason why apparently you wanted to talk to me or Leigh. Is it that you feel that we have compassion for people who get in trouble? Or is it you feel that we can do something for you? Or is it you feel that we have enough integrity that if we promise you something, that we're going to stick to it? Well, let's find out why he wanted to talk to. Why did you want to talk to Mr. Belli, Sam?
I don't want to be hurt.
Jim said, well, maybe he's afraid of being beaten up or something like that. Now, what can I say? Well, why don't we just ask Sam to tell us a little bit more about what he's feeling right now. Tell us about your feelings, Sam. Just tell us anything you want to. And then we'll come back and I'll give you a specific answer to this question, are you going to the gas chamber? Stay with us so I can answer that for you. If it all boils down to the question of you're giving yourself up, if you could be assured that you wouldn't get capital punishment for myself.
I don't want to give myself up.
Huh?
I want to kill those kids.
As you can tell, the conversation did not go as smoothly as intended, as both host Jim Dunbar and attorney Melvin Belli tried to conduct the train of questioning, but oftentimes ended up speaking over one another. Throughout the conversation, the man on the other end of the phone, named Sam, seemed to indicate that he was mentally ill, suffered from pain-inducing headaches, and felt a compulsion to kill again. He ended one phone call with a threat to kill children, which seemed to echo the thoughts of the Zodiac in his last piece of correspondence. Later in the day, both Melvin Belli and Jim Dunbar were asked by the media their thoughts on the caller, and whether or not they thought the call was legitimate.
I assured him he wasn't going to be harmed, and I stood there. And I was a target for him, more than he was a target. And I told him he wasn't going to be harmed, and he wouldn't have been harmed. And that I guaranteed to him, and I wouldn't have done that over the TV to the people of San Francisco and then had him harmed. I'd rather gotten shot in myself first than broken my word on that.
I think we can say honestly that we acted in good faith on this. He requested some assistance, and we tried to give it to him.
You both sound convinced that this is the man, but this is not.
No, we're not convinced, really. I'm not convinced.
I'm convinced
I don't know.
this is a kook.
Well,
I mean a sick man,
yeah,
not a kook in the sense that he's perpetrating a hoax.
Captain Martin Leigh of the San Francisco Police Department's Homicide Division agreed with the decision that the caller was mentally ill, but had to add in that there was very little evidence that he was actually the Zodiac killer.
Not necessarily. I listened to the program. My opinion, for what it's worth, my opinion is that this is no hoaxer, no prankster. The man on that show, I sincerely believe, has a problem, has a mental problem, but he may or may not have been the so-called Zodiac person.
In total, this unknown Sam called over 12 times, although on multiple calls he did not say anything before hanging up. Attempts to trace his number failed, but he did eventually call once more to speak privately with attorney Melvin Belli, and the two apparently made plans to meet up the following day in Daly City, a city just south of San Francisco. San Francisco District Attorney John J. Furden was asked if he had listened to the audio of the morning's television program, and offered up some less than impressed thoughts.
Do you place any credence in the authenticity of the man who's been calling them this morning?
I hadn't heard the television program, Mr. Montgomery, so I couldn't evaluate that. That is exactly the reason that we say, as the District Attorney's Office of the City and County of San Francisco, we are in no position to make any decision until the evidence as to the perpetrator of the crimes is brought to our attention. And as you know, as soon as he's brought to our attention, we'll have no comment to make on the case, because the man is entitled to a fair trial. I will state this categorically. He will receive a fair trial, whoever he is, and he will receive the consideration that any criminal who is brought to our attention does in the administration of justice.
D.A. Furden also insisted that Melvin Belli did not have the authority to make any calls regarding this so-called Zodiac killer, and that he could not guarantee that the person responsible for the crimes would not get a death sentence. After all, the man had not even been identified or charged yet, let alone had to face a jury of his own peers. So any such decision was immature, at the very least. Furden told a reporter about attorney Melvin Belli, quote, "The man is crazier than a shithouse rat, and just as principled." It came as no surprise then, the following day, when the man named Sam failed to show up to his prearranged meeting. Local media flocked to the scene in Daly City, where Melvin Belli waited for the caller to meet up with him. Belli had arrived at the prearranged location, a St. Vincent de Paul thrift store in Daly City, flocked by local reporters and media personalities. Their presence alone made it very unlikely that this unknown Sam was going to show up. But the comments made by DA John J. Furden all but cemented that the Zodiac would never give himself up in such an environment. Belli again spoke to reporters, and insisted that the man behind the phone calls needed help above all, and should not refrain from making contact with him or the authorities. The Oakland police dispatcher, who had first received the call from this mysterious Sam to arrange the TV broadcast, confirmed that the voice heard in the television program was the same person they had spoken to earlier that day. Law enforcement then arranged for past figures in the Zodiac story, Lake Berryessa survivor Brian Hartnell, Vallejo police dispatcher Nancy Slover, and Napa County police officer David Slate, to listen to a recording of the man who had called into Jim Dunbar's AM San Francisco on that morning's broadcast. All three unanimously agreed that the person was not the Zodiac. At least, it was not the person that any of them had interacted with. The lingering mysteries from this series of phone calls would hang over the overall story, even when the Zodiac began corresponding with the media once again. On November 8th, 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle received another handwritten note from the self-proclaimed Zodiac. This note was written on the back of a card, and seemed to be written with a dripping pen, hence its nickname in the assortment of Zodiac correspondence as the quote-unquote dripping pen card. The card read in total, with no real punctuation to speak of, quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I thought you would need a good laugh before you hear the bad news. You won't get the news for a while yet. P.S. Could you print this new cipher on your front page? I get awfully lonely when I am ignored. So lonely, I could do my thing." The final word, thing, was capitalized, underlined a dozen or so times, and given extra enthusiasm with 6 exclamation marks. The bottom of the card contained a similar sight, the cross-haired symbol that the Zodiac had used for himself. And following that was a tally containing the following formula: December, July, August, September, October equals 7. It is assumed that these simply referred to the 5 months of the Zodiac attacks, and the 7 represented the 7 total victims. Along with this last piece of correspondence came a handwritten, hand-drawn cipher, much like the first 3 which had been mailed out to 3 different newspapers. This cipher, though, would prove much harder to crack than the first 3. This cipher, which contained 20 columns and 17 rows, held 340 characters, which have never been decoded. Some have claimed over the years to have deciphered the hidden meaning, or somehow quote-unquote cracked the code, but none of their attempts have been proven and verified by law enforcement agencies. Many believe that this cipher, which was created months after the original 408-character cipher was cracked by Donald Hardin and his wife, Betty, was created as a direct response. And in creating this cipher, the Zodiac had tried to craft something that was impossibly hard to translate, perhaps even impossible. It's likely that this cipher itself is just pure gibberish, which was never meant to be truly solved. That perhaps it's just a token left behind by the Zodiac to infuriate and distract investigators. However, some can pinpoint letter frequency within the cipher, which, they allege, forms actual words. Even they admit, though, that trying to crack this without a key of any sort is basically impossible. The following day, November 9th, 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle received yet another letter from the Zodiac. This letter, which has been dubbed the Death Machine letter, was a 7-page diatribe from the Zodiac, in which he claimed and alleged various things, and escalated his threats against the populace at large. I won't read you the entire letter, as it would probably take me about 20 minutes to do so, but I'll try to touch on several of the topics presented throughout. He began the letter by claiming credit for having killed 7 people, not just attacking 7 people. He then says that he's going to begin changing the methods of his crimes, so that they look like, quote, routine robberies, killings of anger, and a few fake accidents, etc. He says that he looks like the official police description provided, but only when he's killing. And he says that he hasn't left behind any evidence, such as a fingerprint, something we know is blatantly false. However, in this letter he does claim to use 2 coats of airplane cement to coat his fingertips, which is an interesting proposition. He then says that most of his weapons have been purchased from out of state, so that would make them very hard to track for investigators. He also says that he was lurking in the area when police scoped out the neighborhood of Presidio Heights after Paul Stine's murder. Then, he goes on to detail how a couple of police officers pulled him over to speak just minutes after leaving Paul Stine's taxi. He describes this as a near miss, but a total strikeout for police, saying, quote, "Hey pig, doesn't it rile you up to have your nose rubbed in your boo-boos?" He demands that this near miss with police be published in the paper. After that, he goes on to describe a quote-unquote death machine that he has constructed. Most people would consider it a bomb, built of regular run-of-the-mill items. This is what he says he will use to hunt and hurt school children, and he won't do it by shooting, as he said in one of his last letters. Expert analysis would later confirm that this specific concoction could result in a bomb-like device, which could do damage or harm to something, or someone. The San Francisco Chronicle released a story about the Zodiac's most recent letter, and included the detail about the police officers that had allegedly stopped and spoken to him. This is when a figure from the night in question came back into focus. San Francisco police officer Donald Fouke, who had been patrolling the area on the night of Paul Stine's murder, October 11th. That night, Officer Fouke had been partnered with Officer Eric Zelms, who wasn't his usual partner. The two responded to the call of shots fired on Presidio Heights, and were there in just a few minutes, encountering Officer Armand Pellicetti. However, right after this most recent letter from the Zodiac, Officer Fouke decided to admit that there was more to this story. In a memo dated November 12th, 1969, Officer Fouke described how he and Officer Zelms had responded to the call, but had originally been told over police dispatch to be on the lookout for a black male. So on the way there, they did see a white male just a block or two away from the scene of the shooting, but they did not inquire any further because he did not match the suspect description that they were looking for. Of course, as we now know, Officer Pellicetti changed the description just after arriving at the scene, but Officers Fouke and Zelms would not learn of this until they got there. In this November 12th memo, Officer Fouke described that the white male they had seen roughly matched the suspect description later given to them, and that they had seen him walking east on Jackson Street, approximately the same path described by the 3 eyewitnesses who saw the shooter leave the scene in that direction. They had then seen him step into a stairway, which led to the front yard of a home along the north side of the street, before continuing on their way to the crime scene. Officer Fouke's recounting of the events have been viewed as a grievous mistake, but are largely chalked up to as the ramification of poor communication. Nonetheless, they joined the official police record, and Officer Falk was able to complement the eyewitness sketch of the suspect created by the 3 young eyewitnesses. This ultimately became the Zodiac sketch that we are all familiar with. The suspect was described as being a white male, between 35 and 45 years old, standing around 5 feet 10 inches tall, and weighing 180 to 200 pounds. He had a medium to heavy build, was barrel-chested, with a medium complexion, wore glasses, and had light-colored hair, possibly graying in the rear, which was worn in a crew cut. He had walked in a unique fashion, in a kind of hurried, shuffling lope, with his back and neck slightly bent and his head facing down, a description that has creeped into virtually all Zodiac eyewitness accounts. With this most recent revelation, the spotlight was put upon Officer Falk, who had seemingly waited over a month to come forward with this news. But the Zodiac himself must have been feeling rather good, having been able to humiliate and demean a police officer by barely lifting a finger. The next month or so was relatively quiet on the Zodiac front. There were no known letters sent to Bay Area media establishments, and police reported no crimes which pointed the finger at the killer himself. Rumors began to surface that attorney Melvin Belli, who had entered the story in October, when he agreed to speak to the unknown caller on Jim Dunbar's AM San Francisco, had been receiving calls from a strange man that had the same cadence of voice. One of these calls reportedly came in on December 18th, when Belli was away for business. According to allegations made by Robert Graysmith, a cartoonist for the San Francisco Chronicle who gained international acclaim for his involvement in the case, this call was answered by Melvin Belli's maid, who reported that he was gone to the caller. The person on the other end, allegedly, said that they could not wait to speak to Belli, and that it was their birthday. This would become an important part of allegations made by Robert Graysmith later on, but it is also noteworthy because December 18th was the birthday of murder victim Paul Stine. We do know that these calls were happening, because Detective Bill Armstrong, who was handling the case alongside his partner, Dave Toski, reported to the FBI that these calls had been made to Belli's residence. However, in his report, which was dated January 14th, 1970, the dates that this call or these calls came in were never publicly verified. The validity of these calls would be questioned over the years, especially when San Francisco Chronicle reporter Paul Avery summarized his coverage of the Zodiac a year later, in 1971. He would disclose that law enforcement had followed up on the phone call lead, and were actually able to trace the calls. That had taken them to a young man named Eric Weil, who was a mental patient with court-ordered access to a telephone. Duffy Jennings, Paul Avery's successor as the homicide reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, shared the same information in his 1975 book, Great Crimes of San Francisco. He repeated the claim that the phone calls which came into Melvin Belli's residence were that of Eric Weil, who was investigated as a suspect briefly by police, but then cleared. This meant that the phone calls to Belli's home were most likely a hoax, but it was undetermined whether or not the calls that came into Belli and Jim Dunbar at the KGO TV station had been fake as well. Nonetheless, Melvin Belli would receive some legitimate correspondence from the Zodiac, and it came on the 1-year anniversary of his first crime. On December 20th, 1969, a letter would be received by Melvin Belli, which contained another bloody swatch of the shirt which Paul Stine had been wearing when he was murdered. In this letter, which was confirmed to have been written by the Zodiac himself, the killer pled with the attorney to help him out. Quote, "Dear Melvin, this is the Zodiac speaking. I wish you a happy Christmas. The only thing I ask of you is this. Please help me. I cannot reach out for help because of this thing in me won't let me. I am finding it extremely difficult to hold it in check. I am afraid I will lose control again and take my 9th and possibly 10th victim. Please help me. I am drowning. At the moment, the children are safe from the bomb because it is so massive to dig in, and the trigger mech requires much work to get it adjusted just right. But if I hold back too long, I will lose all control of myself and set the bomb up. Please help me. I cannot remain in control for much longer." The letter contained many of the Zodiac's infamous misspellings, and featured a similar writing style. However, the clincher to confirm that this was written by the Zodiac himself was the bloody piece of shirt, which was later confirmed to have come from Paul Stine. The letter also featured the word Christmas, spelled like Christmas, yet again. On March 22nd, 1970, near the city of Modesto, 22-year-old Kathleen Johns was driving on Highway 132. Johns, who worked at a mental hospital in the San Jose area, was driving from her home in San Bernardino to the city of Petaluma to visit her ill mother. She had her 10-month-old daughter in the car with her, and was hoping that the nearly 500-mile road trip would go by quickly. Night had already fallen when a car behind her began honking and flashing its headlights. Fearing the worst, Kathleen pulled over to the side of the road, nervous to find out what was going on. A man stepped out from the driver's seat of the following car and approached her. He told her that the right rear wheel on her vehicle was wobbling, and he offered to tighten up the lug nuts for her to prevent some kind of accident from occurring. Kathleen, who knew very little about cars, agreed. The man grabbed a tool, went to work, and minutes later got back into his own vehicle and drove away. Almost immediately, Kathleen knew something was wrong. Then, like clockwork, the right rear wheel on her car fell off almost immediately, grinding her car into an unfortunate stop. The man who had helped her out had conveniently circled around and offered to drive her to a nearby service station. Once again, she agreed. Over the next 90 or so minutes, the slow realization that she had been abducted creeped into Kathleen's psyche. The man passed by several service stations, which were still open for business. Whenever she tried asking why he was passing them by, he would change the subject, or simply refuse to answer. Some news reports indicated that this man threatened her life, but there is no mention of that in any of the police reports. However, that does not change the fact that for an hour and a half, this man drove around the back roads of Tracy, California, an area just west of Modesto. At one point, when the car creeped to a stop at an intersection, Kathleen decided to jump out, cradling her infant daughter in her arms as she did so. She ran off into a nearby field, where she hid for a matter of minutes. The driver of the vehicle called out and used a flashlight to search for her. Reports vary on whether or not he actually got out of his car or not, but he eventually drove off, frustrated and alone. Kathleen Johns was able to hitchhike to a nearby police station in the city of Patterson, where she gave her statement to the sergeant on duty. She told this sergeant that the man who had abducted her was a white male, around 30 years old, who stood close to 5 feet 9 inches tall, was about 160 pounds, with short dark hair, heavy rimmed glasses, and who wore dark clothing. During this initial statement, Kathleen happened to notice a wanted poster on the wall, which displayed a picture of the man who had killed Paul Stine in San Francisco. That sketch, which had been created by the descriptions presented by Officer Falk and the 3 young eyewitnesses, matched the description of the man that Kathleen had seen just a short time beforehand. She pointed out the similarities to the sergeant, who noted it in the case file. A short time later, when police ran out to inspect Kathleen's vehicle and hopefully help her recover it, she had to wait at a nearby restaurant named Mills. Police eventually did find her car. It had been gutted and torched by an unknown individual. A similar incident, which took place on the same night, was reported by the sister of Zodiac victim Paul Stine. In the weeks after Paul's murder, his brother, Joe, had seemingly challenged the Zodiac. When questioned by local reporters about his thoughts on the case, he boasted, quote, "Come and get me. I don't carry weapons. I don't feel I need any. I was very close to Paul, and now I want a chance at his killer."
Him to make an attempt on me, for I feel if he makes an attempt on me, I definitely can handle him because I'm not the world's best, but if he does, I feel that he'll be caught on this.
There's no feeling among them or other people here in the city that you may be drawing the Zodiac here unnecessarily?
I haven't even considered these people on this. I am very selfish on this. I haven't considered them. That's very selfish on my part.
Are you going to work with the police, or do you plan to take him single-handed?
I will make this statement. San Francisco Police Department has contacted me. Modesto Police Department has not contacted me. So.
But does that mean you will cooperate with the police? If you get a call from the Zodiac, will you notify the Modesto police?
If I get a contact from Zodiac, I will notify Inspector Armstrong. I will not I didn't contact the Modesto Police Department until they contact me on this.
What do you think are the chances that he will contact you, Joe? Are you in fear of your life right now?
I figure a percentage, his attempt will be about 99% against.
Now, months later, on the same night that Kathleen Johns was apparently abducted by a man matching the description of the Zodiac, Paul and Joe's sister, Carol, was similarly threatened by a man on the road. The vehicle apparently pulled up close behind her and flashed its headlights multiple times. When that had not worked, the driver pulled up alongside Carol and pointed towards one of her tires. Carol, who was understandably shaken after the brutal murder of her brother, decided not to play around with this strange man. When she was given the opportunity, she sped up and pulled away from the other driver, at which point he seemed to change his path and headed for another target, Kathleen Johns. On April 20th, 1970, the Zodiac wrote his first letter to the San Francisco Chronicle in over 5 months. Quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. By the way, have you cracked the last cipher I sent you? My name is..." The letter then includes 13 characters, most likely a simple boast from the killer. He then went on to address the recent February 16th explosion out at Golden Gate Park, which had taken the life of San Francisco Police Sergeant Brian McDonnell and wounded several other officers. Quote, "I am mildly curious as to how much money you have on my head now. I hope you do not think that I was the one who wiped out that blue meanie with a bomb at the cop station, even though I talked about killing school children with one. It just wouldn't do to move in on someone else's territory. But there is more glory in killing a cop than a kid because a cop can shoot back. I have killed 10 people to date. It would have been a lot more except that my bus bomb was a dud. I was swamped out by the rain we had a while back. The new bomb is set up like this." The second page of the letter then contains a diagram, which lays out exactly how the Zodiac's death machine bomb is supposed to work. At the very bottom of the diagram, the Zodiac signs off once again. Quote, "P.S. I hope you have fun trying to figure out who I killed. Zodiac equals 10, SFPD equals 0. So, within the last few months, the Zodiac claimed to have taken 3 additional lives, but denied any involvement in the bombing of Sergeant Brian McDonnell from 2 months prior. At this point, one thing was becoming clear. Either the Zodiac enjoyed the spotlight more than anything else, or he was a criminal mastermind. That debate continues today. The next several months would see a cavalcade of correspondence with the mysterious Zodiac, in which the tally at the bottom of the letters grew larger, but the amount of information continued to decrease and the threats continued to lose their impact. On April 28th, 1970, the Zodiac sent a Jolly Roger greeting card to the San Francisco Chronicle. The front bore the following greeting, quote, "I hope you enjoy yourselves when I have my blast." He then signed the card with his cross-haired symbol, and then included a postscript to check the back. There, he stated that he wanted everyone to know about his plans for the bus bomb, and then people had to start wearing Zodiac buttons on top of their clothing. Roughly 2 months later, on June 26th, the Chronicle received another letter. Quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I have become very upset with the people of San Francisco Bay Area. They have not complied with my wishes for them to wear some nice Zodiac buttons. I promised to punish them if they did not comply by annihilating a full school bus. But now school is out for the summer, so I punished them in another way. I shot a man sitting in a parked car with a .38. Zodiac 12, SFPD 0. The man in a parked car that this letter might have been in reference to was San Francisco police officer Richard Raditich, who had been murdered the week before, on June 19, 1970. He had pulled over a vehicle to write a traffic citation at around 5:25 a.m. when another vehicle approached, and he was shot in the head with a .38 caliber pistol. The San Francisco Police Department denied Zodiac involvement in the crime, but it remains unsolved to this day. However, it's worth noting that the Zodiac, who is usually quick to spill details about the crimes he commits, gave no such details for this allegation. Also included with this last letter was a Phillips 66 road map of the San Francisco Bay Area. Where Mount Diablo was, the Zodiac's cross-haired symbol had been drawn, and the numbers 0, 3, 6, and 9 were written. The meaning of this map, and the 32-character cipher that came with it, which supposedly contained the location of a hidden bomb, were never figured out. On July 24th, 1970, yet another letter was received by the Chronicle. Quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am rather unhappy because you people will not wear some nice Zodiac buttons, so I now have a little list, starting with the woman and her baby that I gave a rather interesting ride for a couple hours one evening a few months back, that ended in my burning her car where I found them." In this letter, again, the Zodiac continued to make repeated threats, and offered up no clues or details that had not been published in the press. Just 2 days later, on July 26, 1970, another letter was received by the San Francisco Chronicle. This letter ran over 4 pages in length, so again I won't be reading the entire thing. However, this information did not really include any vital details, but contained an interesting note for investigators to ponder. In this letter, the Zodiac claimed to have killed 13 people, raising his tally again. But in the middle of it, he paraphrased a song from the Mikado, a century-old comic opera. The Zodiac changed the lyrics to include a quote-unquote little list of ways he planned to torture his slaves in paradise. And paradise was again spelled with a C, of course. On October 5th, 1970, another card was received by the San Francisco Chronicle. 3 inches by 5 inches in size. The card was initially deemed a hoax by the media, but detectives Bill Armstrong and Dave Toski later agreed that it was quote-unquote highly probable that the card came from the Zodiac. Quote, "Dear editor, you'll hate me, but I've got to tell you, the pace isn't any slower. In fact, it's just one big 13th. 13. Some of them fought. It was horrible. P.S. There are reports. City police pig cops are closing in on me. Fuck, I'm crack-proof. What is the price tag now?" The card included 13 hole punches, as if the Zodiac was worried his message wasn't being made clear enough. Later that month, the Zodiac made his intentions known when he announced a person that was on his list. The man who had been covering his stories in the San Francisco Chronicle, Paul Avery. On October 27th, 1970, Paul Avery received a Halloween card, which was signed with a letter Z and Zodiac's cross-haired symbol. Avery's name was misspelled as Paul Averly, but the message was clear enough. On a blank section of the card, the word slaves was displayed horizontally, and the misspelled paradise made its appearance vertically. The Zodiac then included the following phrases in the 4 corners: by fire, by gun, by knife, by rope. On the flip side of the card, which bore a skeleton posed in an odd position, the Zodiac had included another number of his own, 14. He was making it clear that he had singled out Paul Avery as his next target. The threat against Paul Avery became a story in its own right, eventually making its way to the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. Members of the Chronicle staff began to wear buttons that read, quote, "I am not Paul Avery." Among those that wore the buttons was Paul Avery himself, who began to prepare himself for an eventual encounter with the Zodiac. For the next year or so, he carried a gun with him at all times, fearful for what may come. However, as this story was unfolding in a very public forum, Paul Avery was investigating a potential lead which would predate all known Zodiac activity. He would eventually publish his findings on November 16th, 1970. Over 2 years before the Zodiac made his first appearance off of Lake Herman Road, another story was unfolding in Riverside, California. This area, in Southern California, was home to Ramona High School. In 1966, a bright young woman named Sherry Jo Bates graduated from Ramona High and looked forward to a long and fruitful future. That following fall, she enrolled at nearby Riverside Community College, where she became an active student and community member. On the night before Halloween, October 30th, 1966, Sherry spent her evening at the campus library. The library closed at 9 p.m., and she was there until closing. Everyone suspected that she had gone right home, but she would not arrive home that evening. Neighbors later told police that around 10:30 p.m., they heard some screaming from the area around the library, but they thought nothing of it. The following morning, Halloween 1966, the body of Sherry Jo Bates was found a short distance away from the library, between two abandoned houses that were set to be demolished. Sherry had been brutally beaten and stabbed, but there was no evidence of any robbery or sexual assault having taken place. A men's Timex wristwatch was found nearby with a torn wristband. The watch's time had stopped at 12:24, but police believed that the crime happened much earlier in the evening than that. The watch would eventually be traced back to a series of watches sold exclusively on military posts, with police theorizing that it might have been from a specific post in England. A heel print was found at the scene as well, which indicated a military-styled shoe between sizes 8 and 10. Authorities also later determined that Sherry Jo Bates' vehicle had been tampered with. Whomever had done so had intentionally disabled her Volkswagen by pulling out the wires from the distributor cap. Police settled upon a couple of suspects from Sherry's orbit, but the case continued to go cold until the perpetrator, or someone claiming to be him, made contact with investigators and the local press. On November 29th, 1966, about a month after the murder, nearly identical typewritten letters were mailed to Riverside Police and the Riverside Press Enterprise. The letters, which were each printed on a royal typewriter, were titled The Confession. The author of the letters claimed responsibility for the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, including several sickening violent details that were not released to the public, and warning that Bates, quote, is not the first and she will not be the last. These letters contained graphic details of Sherry Jo Bates' final moments, and included a possible motive. Sherry had presumably turned down the man that had killed her, and instead of trying to better himself, he decided to take it out on her. As if that wasn't enough, another clue surfaced in December of 1966. A custodian at Riverside City College discovered a poem carved into the bottom of a desk at the library, the last known place that Sherry had been, titled Sick of Living, Unwilling to Die. The poem utilized language that closely resembled the letters sent to Riverside Police and the Riverside Press Enterprise. At the bottom of the poem, the author had carved their initials into the wood of the desk, R.H. Months continued to pass, and Sherry's case continued to fall further and further into cold territory. Then, on April 30th, 1967, 3 nearly identical handwritten letters were received by Riverside Police, the Riverside Press Enterprise, and now, the father of Sherry Jo Bates, Joseph. In the letters to police and the newspaper, the person wrote in large, squiggled letters, quote, Bates had to die, there will be more. In the letter to Joseph Bates, her surname is exchanged for a simple, less honorary, she. However, at the bottom of the 2 letters to the police and the Riverside Press Enterprise, the killers seemed to sign the bottom of the pages with a nearly identical symbol. Almost everyone that has seen it has identified it as a squiggled, shaky-looking letter Z. Paul Avery brought this possible connection to light in his November 1970 article, and while the murder of Sherry Jo Bates has never been confirmed to be connected to the Zodiac, it is one of the most likely candidates. 5 months after his article was published in the San Francisco Chronicle, Paul Avery traveled to Riverside to consult with the local PD about a possible connection to the Zodiac's crime spree. Avery had the Riverside letters examined by Sherwood Morrill, a handwriting expert who worked as the head of question documents for the California Department of Justice. Morrill, who had an exhaustive amount of experience with the Zodiac letters, determined the letters written by Sherry Jo Bates' killer to be, quote, unquestionably the work of the Zodiac. Paul Avery published these findings in March of 1971 and earned a quick response from the Zodiac himself. On March 13th, 1971, the Zodiac responded to Paul Avery's article by sending in a letter to the Los Angeles Times, his first time communicating with a non-Chronicle media outlet since August of 1969. Quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. Like I have always said, I am crack-proof. If the blue meanies are ever going to catch me, they had best get off their fat asses and do something. Because the longer they fiddle and fart around, the more slaves I will collect for my afterlife. I do have to give them credit for stumbling upon my Riverside activity, but they are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there. The reason I'm writing to the Times is this. They don't bury me on the back pages like some of the others. SFPD 0, Zodiac 17+. In this letter, the Zodiac seemed to swipe directly at both the San Francisco Chronicle for refusing to publish his letters on the front page, and at Paul Avery himself, by crediting the police for discovering this potential lead in Riverside. However, many have pointed out that unlike some of his earlier letters, the Zodiac offered up no new details or new evidence in the Sherry Jo Bates murder. Instead, he only took vague responsibility for the crime, perhaps in an effort to bolster his reputation somewhat. As we see, at the bottom tally, he increased his victim total to 17, but offered up no details on any of those either. To this date, the possibility of a connection between the murder of Sherry Jo Bates and the Zodiac remains uncertain. Both Riverside PD and Paul Avery maintain that the Bates homicide was not committed by the Zodiac, but the letters were just an attempt to claim credit for the attack, just like the Zodiac's other attempts to steal credit for unrelated attacks and assaults. However, in Paul Avery's digging, it came to light that Riverside PD developed a suspect in the months after the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, who has become one of the most widely discussed Zodiac candidates. Ross Sullivan was born on July 28, 1941, in New York State. He eventually moved to California and attended Glendale High School, where he graduated in 1959. He then went on to attend and work at Riverside City College, where he was noted for some odd behaviors. In fact, he had once written an odd poem that seemed to attract attention, and which irked staff members of the library. On the days after the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, Sullivan had failed to show up for work. Some reports indicate that he was out for several days, but I can't find an official reporting of that. The following year, 1967, Sullivan transferred to a different college in Santa Cruz, California, hours north, near the San Francisco Bay Area. On February 6, 1968, 26-year-old Sullivan was arrested for dancing naked in a quote-unquote dazed trance, as quoted from a local paper. He was booked on indecent exposure and disorderly conduct charges, which normally wouldn't be a big deal in their own right. But in the paper, which listed him as being 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing close to 300 pounds, it also describes him being taken to General Hospital for a 72-hour mental hold, where he would undergo a full mental evaluation. After this incident, he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and would not have any more public outbursts until 1973, when he would be held in a Santa Cruz mental ward. At around the same time that this happened, correspondence with the Zodiac seemed to drop off for a period of time. In some 1977 correspondence between San Francisco detective Dave Toski and another law enforcement agent named David Peterson, Sullivan's name is brought up as a potential Zodiac suspect. They propose fingerprint comparison, but it is unknown how far along in the process they were throughout that year. You see, in September of 1977, Ross Sullivan passed away in his Santa Cruz home. The death certificate made note of extreme obesity, and while his official cause of death was unknown, it is listed as likely heart failure. It is truly unknown how far along the investigation was into Ross Sullivan, as both a Zodiac suspect and for potential involvement in the Sherry Jo Bates murder, when he passed away in 1977. But his name has remained at the top of the list for many Zodiac enthusiasts and researchers when it comes to noted suspects. Even though the Riverside connection and the potential involvement of Ross Sullivan remained something juicy for investigators to pore over, it did not stop the active state of the investigation. Roughly a week after writing to the Los Angeles Times, a postcard was received by the San Francisco Chronicle. The card, which was received on March 22, 1971, was addressed personally to Paul Averley. The card, which consisted of words and phrases cut out of various advertisements and magazine lettering, seemed to point towards Lake Tahoe and a potential 12th victim. Avery and the rest of the Chronicle reporters theorized that this might point to some involvement in the recent disappearance of a woman who worked in that area. Donna Loss was a 25-year-old who lived in State Line, California. She worked as a nurse at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino nearby South Lake Tahoe, which is now a Hard Rock Cafe. On the morning of September 6, 1970, Donna worked until roughly 2 o'clock in the morning, treating her last patient at around 1:40 a.m. She left work and seemingly headed home. However, later that day, both Donna's employer and her landlord had received phone calls from an unknown male individual who falsely claimed that Donna had left town due to a family emergency. This would later be determined to be a complete fabrication. Donna Loss was never found. Her car was left behind at her apartment complex, which itself was just a few blocks away from the scene of the Paul Stein murder from the year prior. A potential gravesite would later be found near Norden, California. However, an excavation there only found a pair of sunglasses, but no evidence or clues pointing towards the fate of Donna Loss. To date, there has never been any confirmed involvement between this case and the Zodiac's crime spree, but that did not stop investigators from trying to find clues where there weren't any to be found. In November of 1972, Santa Barbara County Sheriff's officials tried to make a connection between one of their outstanding cold cases and the open Zodiac case. Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were seniors at Lompoc High School in the area around Santa Barbara. Domingos, who was 18 years old, decided to skip school for senior ditch day. His 17-year-old fiancée, Linda, agreed to skip along with him. Instead of going to school, they decided to head down to a beach near Lompoc, where they spent a chunk of the day doing nothing but sunbathing and frolicking in the water. However, police later theorized that while they were out sunbathing, an assailant had accosted the two teenagers, bringing along pre-cut lengths of narrow rope, insisting that one of them tie up the other. At some point, the two teenagers managed to free themselves from the situation and attempted to make a run for it. Both Robert and Linda were shot repeatedly in the back and the chest with a .22 caliber weapon. The close proximity of the shots indicated a high level of firearm expertise. At that point, the bodies of the young couple were dragged approximately 30 feet and placed in a small shack along the beach. Linda was placed on top of Robert, and it was later revealed that Linda's bathing suit top had been cut by a knife, exposing her for the killer's enjoyment. When the two bodies had been piled into the wooden shack, it appeared that the assailant attempted to burn down the shack with wooden matches, but they then failed spectacularly. Sheriff John Carpenter and Detective Bill Baker of the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office tried to make the case that this crime bore many similarities to the Zodiac attacks, including the usage of a similar kind of .22 caliber ammunition that was used in the Lake Herman Road murders, and pointing out that this attack bore many striking similarities to the Lake Berryessa attack in Napa County. However, no link between the cases has been proven, although any confirmation would successfully link the Zodiac to Southern California, and predate any other known activity by at least 3 years. There was no confirmed communication between the Zodiac and the media between March of 1971 and January of 1974, when a suspicious letter was received by the San Francisco Chronicle. The letter, which arrived on January 29, 1974, seemed rather innocuous at first. It seemed to address a recent hit film, The Exorcist, but quickly took a dark turn. Quote, "I saw and think The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. Signed, yours truly." He plunged himself into the billowy wave and an echo arose from the suicide's grave. Titwillow, Titwillow, Titwillow. P.S. If I do not see this note in your paper, I will do something nasty, which you know I'm capable of doing. Me, 37. SFPD, 0. This letter, which contained another snippet of a verse from the Mikado, also featured an unusual symbol at the bottom, which is unexplained to this day. However, it was placed at the same spot where the Zodiac usually left his notorious crosshairs. This was followed up by a letter sent to the San Francisco Chronicle a few days later, on February 14th. In this letter, someone named, quote, a friend, informed the editor that the initials for the Symbionese Liberation Army, an active left-wing terrorist group, spelled slaw, a Norwegian word meaning kill. Despite the handwriting looking very similar, this letter was not confirmed to belong to the Zodiac. Then, on May 8th, 1974, the Chronicle received yet another unrelated letter, addressed to the paper's editors. This letter was largely a complaint that the movie Badlands was being advertised in the paper, and the author, who identified themselves only as a quote-unquote citizen, felt that the film was quote-unquote murder glorification. They therefore asked the paper to cut advertising for the flick. It would later be determined that the handwriting, tone, and surface irony were all eerily similar to the earlier Zodiac letters. There was another letter sent in July of that year, 1974, which seemed similar in tone and complained about the Chronicle publishing the writings of anti-feminist Marco Spinelli. The letter was signed The Red Phantom, and in parentheses, quote-unquote, red with rage. But the handwriting and messaging seemed off, even for a Zodiac letter, so this has also never been confirmed to be his handiwork. While many still argue over which of these 1974 letters were authentic or not, it is almost undisputed that the Zodiac himself was still enjoying his time in the spotlight. And now, 5 years removed from any actual murders, he was probably hoping to keep that active in some fashion. But it was at this point, the Zodiac seemed to fade away from any correspondence with the media. Or did he? By the mid-1970s, San Francisco homicide detective Dave Toski had become a bit of a cultural icon, inspiring fictional heroes such as Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry Callahan and Steve McQueen's Lieutenant Frank Bullitt. In fact, George Lucas would name a fictional landmark in the original Star Wars film after Toski, in the form of Tosche Station. He had become known for his exuberant dress code, constantly wearing bow ties and an exaggerated trench coat. However, in America, he was most well known as the lead investigator of the Zodiac Killer, a case he had somehow lucked into while working on call on a fateful October weekend in 1969. 7 years later, in 1976, Detective Toski spoke to a reporter about the active state of the investigation, which had consumed countless nights and hours from his life. He stated that he personally believed that the Zodiac had, and still currently, lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. Quote, he has a personal box score of 37. We know for sure he killed at least 6 and wounded 2 in the late 1960s, but there are many unsolved homicides. He hasn't taken credit for any specific killings in the last few years. Yet whenever we get a new letter or postcard from him, the score goes up. Toski also stated that he believed the letters had become a bit of a game for the Zodiac's ego, and that his regular life was likely not that thrilling, hence the Zodiac escapades. Quote, he's a weekend killer. Why can't he get away Monday through Thursday? Does his job keep him close to home? I would speculate he maybe has a menial job, is well thought of, and blends into the crowd. I think he's quite intelligent and better educated than someone who misspells words as frequently as he does in his letters. Eventually, Detective Toski was asked the question that anyone would ask. Do you think you are going to catch the Zodiac Killer? Quote, to be honest, I'm no closer now to solving the case. It's been a paper chase for me. My files are getting larger, but I doubt I'll get him unless he makes a mistake or strikes again. I don't know who or where he is. As the years continued to pass, the odds of detectives stumbling upon the path of the Zodiac became less and less likely. Eventually, the 70s were coming to an end, and the decade anniversary of the Zodiac's assorted murders began to look like a benchmark for the case. But then, in April of 1978, the Zodiac Killer entered the news once again.
San Francisco was terrorized in the late 60s and early 70s by a man who called himself the Zodiac Killer. He claimed 37 murders. Police confirmed at least 6. 4 years ago, the killing stopped, and so did Zodiac's letter. Now there's another letter. For that, Tom Shell.
San Francisco police displayed a blackboard with excerpts of the latest Zodiac letter at a news conference last night. Police are convinced it's authentic. Deputy San Francisco Police Chief Clem D'Amica said it's the 16th letter received from the Zodiac Killer and the first since 1974. Letter number 16 has breathed new life into the investigation of at least 6 murders blamed on the Zodiac. Old files will be reviewed again. For the last 9 years, the Zodiac investigation has been headed by Homicide Inspector David Toski.
I have always felt a gut feeling that he was not dead and that he was out there somewhere and that he would communicate. I was always hoping that he would communicate and not commit an act. A letter I can handle.
The latest letter from the Zodiac poses more questions than it answers. Questions like, why has he only communicated twice in the past 9 years? Has he killed in that time? No clues in the latest letter. But more importantly, who is the Zodiac and where is he?
The letter received by the San Francisco Chronicle on April 24th, 1978, read as follows. Quote, Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. I am back with you. Tell Herb Cain I am here. I have always been here. That city pig Toski is good, but I am smarter and better. He will get tired, then leave me alone. I am waiting for a good movie about me. Who will play me? I am now in control of all things. Yours truly. The letter was initially deemed authentic, but trouble arose just months later when the news of this 1978 letter made it to Armistead Maupin, who worked for the San Francisco Chronicle and was also writing an ongoing book series about a detective in San Francisco. Maupin picked up similarities between this most recent Zodiac letter and fan letters written to him in 1976, which he believed were written by none other than Detective Dave Toski.
For the first time since the Zodiac case began 9 years ago, Inspector Dave Toski is out of it. Toski is under fire for writing phony fan letters about himself to a newspaper feature writer, Armistead Maupin. And Maupin today came up with far more serious charges, that there are similarities between the letters Toski admits writing to Maupin and the most recent Zodiac letter of last April.
I received the bogus fan letters in the fall of 1976. I took no official action on them at the time because I regarded them as a harmless if somewhat reckless action on the part of a police officer. I chose to turn the matter over to police only when I noticed certain similarities between the tone of the letters and the tone of the last Zodiac letter.
Toski admits writing the fan letters to Maupin, but vigorously denies having anything to do with the letters purporting to come from the killer, known as Zodiac. Toski was low profile at the Hall of Justice today. He had been officially reprimanded over the fan letters by being transferred from the homicide detail to the pawn shop detail. And an official investigation is underway on any connection he might have with the Zodiac letters. Thus far, the experts can't agree on the authenticity of the last letter from the Zodiac. Right now, Toski is admitted to nothing more than being guilty of an indiscretion.
Dave Toski found himself in extremely hot water for this incident, as it appeared to his superiors and to the press that he had perhaps been writing some of, if not most of, the most recent Zodiac letters. If so, investigators would have to move the point of their last Zodiac correspondence to 1971, when he professed some involvement in the Sherry Joe Bates murder from Riverside, California. Toski admitted to writing the fan mail, professing his adoration of the book series and saying that it was a goofy, childish thing that he did for fun. However, he explicitly stated, quote, I wrote no Zodiac letter. I don't need another letter. It only brings me tons of extra work. It's strain enough being in homicide. Toski was later cleared of any involvement in the letter writing, when handwriting samples determined that he did not write them. However, the stain on his record remained there, permanently. And even though he seemed poised to replace Charles Gain as San Francisco police chief, this scandal ultimately ended those dreams. The authenticity of this 1978 letter remains unverified, with some experts pointing out that the handwriting seems to match the Zodiac style, while others point out the formatting and other issues with tone. Some have even theorized that this letter may have been written by other parties that wanted to drum up interest in the Zodiac story once again, but ultimately, nothing has been determined. The 1978 letter remains a mystery. Over the years, there has been some alleged correspondence with the Zodiac, but none of it has ever been confirmed. In 1981, a letter was received by Atlanta television station WXIA-TV on the other side of the country. The letter, which was postmarked March 8, 1981, was received just a day or so later. It read, quote, "Hello, it's me. Haven't you people figured out who is killing these little people yet? I'll give you a hint. I used to be in San Francisco. I used to stalk women, but I like to kill children now. At all my victims' bodies I have left certain clues, but I guess it's too much for you rebels to handle. So I guess I'll have to tell you. I'll try to kill children because they are so easy to pick off. By the way, if you still have letters from the other murders, I am not writing in the same handwriting." The letter is then signed Zodiac, and given the same cross-haired logo as the original Zodiac letters. As you may have guessed, the handwriting in this letter differed noticeably from the original Zodiac letters. However, it seemed to be taking credit for the recent rash of child murders in the Atlanta area, which would later be attributed to Wayne Williams. This letter was forwarded to the FBI, who conducted their own analysis, which ultimately came up undetermined. Robert Graysmith, a man who had spent years working as a cartoonist for the San Francisco Chronicle, had long held a fascination with the story of the Zodiac killer. When the letters began arriving at the Chronicle he worked at, he began documenting everything he could find, including newspaper clippings and various pieces of evidence that he could get his hands on. Eventually, the idea of a book entered his mind. He doubted whether or not anyone would actually read it, but viewed the story as one that needed to be preserved. Quote, "I saw it going into obscurity. Nobody is sharing all the different jurisdictions and all this information. What if I, as a private citizen, went around and got this information?" After over a decade of exhaustive research, and nearly losing himself in the quest to find the Zodiac killer, he published his book Zodiac in 1986. It immediately became a bestseller and rejuvenated interest in the story. The book contained much of the public knowledge of the Zodiac himself. In fact, many have credited this book for keeping the case in the spotlight, and for turning a relatively forgettable series of events into America's most infamous criminal cold case. However, many also critique Robert Graysmith's fast and loose approach to journalism, where he seemed to throw everything at the wall to see what stuck. Several people who held supposed conversations within the book recall things unfolding in a much different way, and go against Graysmith's own recollection of events. Richard Harnett, who reviewed Zodiac for the Los Angeles Times in February of 1986, weighed in with his own thoughts about the book, stating that a, quote, "good account of all the facts in the Zodiac affair would have been a valuable contribution, but Graysmith, a newspaper cartoonist, took on the role of amateur sleuth rather than historian. He neglects those parts of the historical record that don't fit into his scenario." Graysmith's book focused a large portion of its pages on a suspect that Graysmith personally suspected, who he used the name Robert Hall Starr to describe. This name was just an alias, but it would become pertinent very soon. One angle that was taken by some in the press was that this book perhaps overly glorified the actions of the Zodiac, and would perhaps inspire copycats. Armistead Maupin, the Chronicle columnist and author who had gotten dragged into the 1978 letter scandal, weighed in with his own thoughts about the publication of Zodiac. Quote, "I think the public has already been terrified far too much by this boogeyman story." It came as no surprise when, just a few months after the publication of Robert Graysmith's Zodiac, another letter was received by the San Francisco Chronicle, its first in nearly a decade. The postmark was unclear, but it seemed to have been sent on May 6, 1986, and read as follows. Quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am still out here and crack-proof. I want you to know about the latest slaves that I have collected about 2 weeks ago up by Sacramento, California. I will give you a clue to help you with the mystery. They were killed by a freeway. The blue meanies almost caught me. The body count is growing now, 100 plus all over the state of California and Nevada. SFPD 0, Zodiac 100+. This letter, which seemed legitimate, featured some similar grammatical and spelling errors that the Zodiac was most known for, but also included many scribbled out words and formatting issues, such as the Zodiac trying to squeeze in a word above another. I also only assumed that he meant the state of Nevada at the end because he used the abbreviation NA, which does not indicate anyone's specific state. The author of the letter seemed to be addressing the recent double murder of Koi Len Seichow and Choi Phao Sali, a Laotian couple that had been shot repeatedly near Highway 99 and I-5, up near Sacramento, in April of 1986. The two had been visiting their hospitalized son in Merced, California, when they stopped to take a break alongside the highway. Then, an unknown attacker shot them over 15 times, leaving their bodies to be discovered by the police sometime later. This letter has never been verified as belonging to the Zodiac, despite containing similar handwriting and the Zodiac symbol signature. This is because Robert Graysmith's book, Zodiac, had basically informed the readers, through its reproduction of the original Zodiac letters, how to recreate them. As such, this last letter was deemed a hoax and not given any credence in law enforcement. Another similar issue arose in the early 1990s, just a handful of years after Robert Graysmith's book was published.
Responsibility for the New York shootings has written letters to the New York Post and 60 Minutes claiming that he is San Francisco's notorious Zodiac killer. Police say they think it's all a hoax, but the possibility is an alarming one.
The Zodiac murders started in 1966. The killer sent cryptic letters to the San Francisco Chronicle. The letters rambled. They hinted at Satanism. Between 1968 and 1987, someone calling himself the Zodiac claimed responsibility for up to 40 murders. Now, 3 shootings in New York, none fatal. A writer to the New York Post claims responsibility. The letter contains astrological signs in strange writing. Quote, "This is the Zodiac. The 12 sign will die when the belts in the heaven are seen." A source at the New York Post says the note doesn't appear similar to the San Francisco Zodiac letters.
Between March of 1990 and October of 1993, 8 people were shot in New York City. 5 of these shooting victims survived, but the other 3, 2 men and 1 woman, suffered terrible injuries. In the case of the lone female murder victim, Patricia Fonte, she had been shot once in the back and then stabbed over 100 times. The brutality and sudden violence of the crimes invoked fears of Son of Sam, but when the killer began corresponding with the media and police, they claimed to be the infamous Zodiac killer. This person seemed to be targeting their victims based on their astrological sign, and made that clear in their correspondence with the media. However, any fears that these crimes were being perpetrated by California's infamous Zodiac killer were deflated when 26-year-old Heriberto Eddie Seda, an unemployed high school dropout, was arrested and charged with the crimes in 1996. He had apparently been a big fan of the Zodiac killer's methods, having only been a year old when the Lake Herman Road murders took place. He, as everyone feared, was nothing more than a Zodiac copycat, who ended up getting sentenced to over 232 years for his various offenses. The case of the Zodiac killer remained open throughout the 1990s, but was no longer being actively investigated by detectives. Too much time had passed for there to be any real inroads made, so law enforcement kept it open should any new details surfaced. The case has remained in this unusual stasis, most particularly in Napa County and the city of Riverside, where the Lake Berryessa attack and the murder of Sherry Jo Bates remain high priorities for cold case investigators. However, the San Francisco Police Department, who got involved with the case following the shooting death of Paul Stein, officially marked the case inactive in April of 2004. But by March of 2007, they had reopened the case, due to an unusual detail that had somehow slipped past them. On March 3rd, 2007, it was discovered that an American greeting Christmas card had been sent to the San Francisco Chronicle nearly 2 decades beforehand. This Christmas card, which was postmarked in Eureka in 1990, was rediscovered in photo files by the Chronicle's editorial assistant, Daniel King. They were able to dig up the card and gave it to experts for examination. Inside of the envelope, along with the card, was a photocopy of 2 U.S. postal keys on a magnet keychain. Along with that intriguing find, an initial analysis ruled that the handwriting from the Christmas card resembled the handwriting of the Zodiac. Lloyd Cunningham, a forensic document examiner, declared this card inauthentic, but other experts and researchers have gone on the record to disagree with his finding. This Christmas card would push back the date of the Zodiac's known correspondence to 1990, almost 2 decades after his last authenticated letter. However, it still remains a point of contention among Zodiac researchers and enthusiasts. Speaking of a point of contention, right around that same time, March of 2007, the story of the Zodiac would be brought to the big screen. On March 2nd, 2007, David Fincher's film Zodiac would be released to the world, based on the 1986 novel of the same name, written by Robert Graysmith. The film also included some new details from Graysmith's follow-up book, which had been published a few years beforehand. To step off my host pedestal for a moment, I just want to say that this movie is legitimately one of my favorites. I'm a huge fan of Fincher's style of filmmaking, and this movie is just really the golden standard of true crime or mystery stories being given the Hollywood treatment. So if you haven't seen it yet, that's my stamp of approval, and even over a decade later, you absolutely should watch it. Despite drawing much of its premise from the novel of the same name, the movie tried to cling close to realism as much as possible, and the filmmakers were given access to legitimate case files, and they were able to interview the investigators, eyewitnesses, and survivors of the Zodiac attacks. Brian Hartnell, the survivor of the Lake Berryessa attack, gave the film an incredible amount of credit. Quote, "What they've captured on the film that you see when Cecilia is being stabbed, that's the flash I saw happening. It's an eerie reproduction of what happened in my vision. I could not have scripted it any better." As was the case with Robert Graysmith's book, the film earned some demerits from hardcore Zodiac researchers and enthusiasts, who nitpicked the finer details of the film, but even they had to begrudgingly admit that the film was incredibly well made. However, this movie focused on the suspect that Robert Graysmith, the former cartoonist of the San Francisco Chronicle turned Zodiac expert, had spent over 2 years building a case around. That suspect's name was Arthur Leigh Allen. Arthur Leigh Allen was born on December 18, 1933, exactly 6 years before the Zodiac's 5th and final murder victim, Paul Stine. His father was an established military man, and Arthur, who went by his middle name of Leigh, grew up in the area of Vallejo, California. Leigh enlisted in the United States Navy in 1956, hoping to live up to his father's legacy. However, his service was very short-lived, and he was honorably discharged in 1958. From there, he moved back to his parents' home in Vallejo, where he worked a number of on-again, off-again jobs over the next few years. He went back to school, and eventually became a school teacher. He moved to an area just south of Sacramento in 1966, and began working as a teacher shortly thereafter. However, he was fired from his job as an elementary school teacher in March of 1968. The reason was that there were allegations of sexual misconduct with his students. In other words, child molestation. It began to come to light that Leigh, who had been mostly well regarded by those in his life, had been described as being fixated on young children. Others described him as harboring an anger towards women, and both friends and family struggled to recall any romantic relationships that Leigh held with anyone. On October 4th, 1969, Leigh was interviewed by Detective John Lynch of the Vallejo Police Department. This was roughly a week before the shooting of Paul Stine, and just a week or so after the attack out on Lake Berryessa. Detective Lynch told Leigh that he had been reported out in the vicinity of the attack at around the same time, and Leigh told him that he had indeed been out there, at Salt Point, scuba diving on the same day that the attack at Lake Berryessa took place. This eventually became a note in a case file, but went mostly unfollowed up on for a couple of years. That is, until 1971, when a man named Donald Cheney reported Leigh to authorities. At this point, Zodiac fever had taken over, and authorities were desperate to make any progress in the case. They listened to Cheney, and he told them things that they found incredibly interesting, including details such as Arthur Leigh Allen having spoken to him about his desire to kill people, that he wanted to use the nickname Zodiac, that he was going to secure a flashlight to a firearm for visibility at night. Cheney told police that this conversation had taken place no later than January 1st, 1969, roughly a week after the Zodiac began attacking. On August 4th, 1971, Arthur Leigh Allen was questioned at his place of work in Pinole, California. This is where Leigh became one of the most intriguing suspects for detectives, as they noticed he wore a Zodiac brand of wristwatch, made references to a book titled The Most Dangerous Game, and embodied many of the characteristics that investigators had come to associate with the Zodiac. Through the next several months, investigators tried to work out the case against Allen, eventually culminating in a search warrant of his residence in 1972. This brought them many interesting clues, but nothing definitive. There was no handwriting match, no fingerprint match, really nothing at all. So, at that point, investigators had to drop Arthur Leigh Allen as a suspect. He would not stay out of trouble for long, though. In 1974, Leigh was arrested for committing lewd acts with a 12-year-old boy. He pleaded guilty to the charge and was given a 2-year sentence, eventually being released in 1977. Over the next decade or so, Leigh continued to work a number of odd jobs, moving out on his own and living a quiet, isolated life. That all changed in 1986, however, when Robert Graysmith published his book, Zodiac. In it, a man matching all of Leigh's characteristics, named Bob Hall Starr, is maligned as the unfortunate result of police not having enough evidence to press charges. The media, who were able to piece 2 and 2 together, were quickly able to determine that Robert Hall Starr was just an alias for Arthur Leigh Allen. And soon, he found himself hounded by reporters and journalists that wanted the scoop on his life story. Over the next few years, he managed to avoid the limelight. But then the police began digging into his stories and alibis once again. In February of 1991, Vallejo police conducted another search of his property. They found many things that they determined were suspicious, including firearms, which could not legally be possessed by a felon, but no charges were filed. Arthur Leigh Allen decided to break his media silence and spoke about his most recent encounters with law enforcement.
There are 2 types of liars in the world, fishermen and policemen, and not necessarily in that order. And their function is lying to you is to trip you up. They can't do it to me because I have nothing to trip over.
There are a lot of people around who with all this bad publicity, are probably sure that I'm Zodiac. People who know me, no problem. Thank God for our Constitution, because that says a person is innocent until proven guilty.
He even spoke about the property which had been taken by the search warrant.
They took a lot of my tapes. They took samples of my handwriting. They screwed up a lot of my stuff here too, but that wasn't, they didn't take that. They took a couple of typewriters.
There were a couple of typewriters taken from Allen's residence in this 1991 search, including a Royal typewriter with an Elite type, the same model that had been used to type out the letters sent to Riverside Police and the Riverside Press-Herald following the 1966 murder of Sherry Jo Bates. It is unknown whether any tests were actually conducted to confirm if this was the same exact model, though. Arthur Leigh Allen, who continued to speak to the press, argued that this harassment he was receiving for the Zodiac crimes had ruined his life.
Well, they weren't able to get me for the simple reason that I've never killed anyone in my life and don't intend to. There were coincidences that tended to point towards me, and killing just for the pleasure of it, it's just totally foreign to me.
I'm not the Zodiac killer. I know that. I know that deep in my soul. I've never been known for good luck, and I guess this is pretty much living proof of it. I couldn't murder anyone. It's difficult as hell, and it can be it can be terribly depressing. And if I deserved any of it, that would be something different, but I don't.
As I said, no charges were filed following this 1991 search, even though Allen was legally not allowed to own or possess firearms as a convicted felon. That is because, perhaps, the responsible parties took pity on his current situation. Arthur Lee Allen had been struggling with heart problems and diabetes for some time, and that eventually led to his death just a short time later, in 1992. Just 2 days after his death, authorities conducted yet another search of his home, and seized several items that they noted were of interest. It is unknown what these items were, as their details have never been released, and it is unknown whether or not any of the jurisdictions with open Zodiac cases are ever going to label Arthur Lee Allen as the Zodiac Killer. There are a lot of points of evidence both for and against Arthur Lee Allen as a Zodiac suspect, so I'll just try to run through them briefly. As I've already said, there was a typewriter taken during a 1991 search that was consistent with a model needed to type letters pertaining to the Sherry Jo Bates murder in Riverside, California. Arthur Lee Allen, as it has been noted in other documentaries and books, might have had some kind of connection to Riverside, but that is mostly undetermined. As I also said, Arthur Lee Allen wore a Zodiac brand wristwatch, which contained the same symbol used by the Zodiac in his correspondence with the Bay Area media. Allen lived in Vallejo, which many law enforcement experts consider to be the home of the Zodiac. It is also worth noting that he worked just minutes away from where Darlene Ferrin lived, and at times was just miles away from where the Zodiac Killer had been hunting. Allen had the same physical characteristics of the Zodiac. He stood about 6 feet tall, weighed around 250 pounds, and had light, thinning brown hair. He also had a unique style of walking, which was pretty consistent with the eyewitness descriptions of Zodiac's walking style. In 1991, surviving Zodiac victim Mike Micheal was shown a photo lineup by George Bewart of the Vallejo Police Department. This was the first time that Micheal had looked at photos of suspects, and in his first go of it, he identified Arthur Lee Allen as the man who had shot both Darlene Ferrin and him in the summer of 1969. However, this is questioned by Micheal's own testimony, which admitted that he had been blinded by a high-powered flashlight and flashes of gunshots, and he did not get a decent look at the shooter. He even described his own eyewitness sightings as quote-unquote more of an outline than an outright description. This is where we start to get into some of the evidence on the side of Arthur Lee Allen's innocence. Fingerprints tested from the crime scene of Paul Stine and Cecilia Shepard's murders, from San Francisco and Napa County respectively, were both tested against Arthur Lee Allen's fingerprints. Both tests came back negative. Then, multiple fingerprint samples and a palm print from the Zodiac letters were compared to Arthur Lee Allen. Again, all came back negative. As if that wasn't enough, in 2002, the San Francisco Police Department developed a partial DNA profile from the surface of the Zodiac letters' stamps and envelopes. This was compared to Allen's DNA, and also came back negative. However, Tom Voigt, the curator of the website ZodiacKiller.com, later stated that this method of DNA testing was not effective. Quote, "It turns out the DNA obtained from a Zodiac correspondence back in 2002 was taken from the outside of a stamp, meaning it might well belong to the mailman and not the Zodiac Killer. Nonetheless, it was another negative result for anything that proved Arthur Lee Allen's guilt." Lloyd Cunningham, a forensic document expert, has even gone on the record to state, quote, "They gave me banana boxes full of Allen's writing, and none of his own writing even came close to the Zodiac. Nor did DNA extracted from the envelopes on the Zodiac letters come close to Arthur Lee Allen." Statements like this were combated by enthusiasts and researchers like Robert Graysmith, who have argued that Arthur Lee Allen being ambidextrous circumvents this argument. Since Allen could write with both hands, it was possible that that explained why none of the letters matched his own writings. However, that too is a flawed argument, as the lack of any evidence is still not close to proving Arthur Lee Allen's guilt. Dave Toski, the San Francisco detective who handled the Zodiac case for many years, stated that all evidence against Arthur Lee Allen ultimately, quote, "turned out to be negative." Authorities, for a time, even considered looking into Donald Cheney as a suspect. Don Cheney, who was a former friend of Arthur Lee Allen, actually contacted police in 1971 to report him as a Zodiac suspect. However, as time went on, some of the details that Cheney shared about Allen made police view him somewhat cryptically. As one Zodiac detective stated, quote, "Sometimes I wonder if he had more involvement with Zodiac than he's let on." During an initial round of questioning by investigators, Cheney had told them that he had once gone to Arthur Lee Allen's house as a friend and noticed a stack of letters, which the other man had been meaning to send out. Allen then allegedly asked Cheney to help him finish up by licking the stamps and putting the envelopes together. Police viewed this almost as a soft admission of some involvement in whatever Arthur Lee Allen had been up to, as if Cheney viewed this as getting ahead of the curve by admitting to his fingerprints or other forensic evidence being on the Zodiac letters. However, all of this is really null, because Cheney was never named a suspect, and when Arthur Lee Allen's DNA was tested against the partial DNA profile in 2002, authorities submitted a sample of Cheney as well. Just like Allen, it came back negative. Over time, many have tried to link the Zodiac crime spree to that of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. These were a series of shootings that took place in Texarkana, Texas, between February and May of 1946. In an eerie coincidence, that crime spree also resulted in 5 people being killed, with 3 others wounded in the aftermath. The killer was later given the nickname the Phantom, or the Phantom Killer, because of the time he struck and his ability to quickly disappear. The first victims of Texarkana's Phantom Killer, named Jimmy Hollis and Mary Larry, had been parked along a quiet lover's lane when they were attacked. The Phantom, as he would later be known, utilized tactics that the Zodiac would later perfect. He used a flashlight to blind his victims, and then told them to run off while he tried to subdue and shoot at them. Jimmy Hollis described the shooter, who was wearing a pillowcase-looking mask over his head, as being a white man around 30 years old. Mary Larry, who got a better look at the killer, described him as being an African-American male. They ended up splitting the difference, and saying that he might have been a young, dark-tanned man under the age of 30, who stood around 6 feet tall. He might have also been a light-skinned African-American man. The Phantom Killer attacked in similar circumstances as the Zodiac, primarily sticking to lovers' lanes, before eventually deciding to attack a couple in their mid-30s in their home. This Phantom used a .32 caliber weapon for most of his assaults, but also used a .22 caliber weapon in a later attack. Police described him as being shrewd, but also incredibly lucky in his attacks. A psychological profile stated that he might have been a sadist who enjoyed killing as a sport, and would most likely try to act out again. When the crime spree came to an end in May of 1946, many believed that the Phantom simply moved on to a new area. However, they perhaps thought this because the idea of living among someone that caused so much terror in such a short amount of time is a terrifying proposition. The case remained embedded in the town's memory, but was given notoriety when the 1976 film The Town That Dreaded Sundown was released. Immediately, the story drew many correlations to the Zodiac Killer, who had struck just a handful of years beforehand along the West Coast. And ever since then, many have considered the possibility that Texarkana's Phantom might have moved west sometime after 1946. Over the years, many have come forward with their own idea on Zodiac suspects. Most of the time, these people usually have something to sell, like an upcoming tell-all novel, or a documentary based on their life story. In 2007, a man named Dennis Kaufman claimed that his stepfather, a man named Jack Terrence, was the Zodiac. He turned over several items to the FBI, including a hood that was allegedly similar to the one worn by the Zodiac. DNA analysis conducted by the FBI in 2010 was deemed inconclusive. In 2009, a former lawyer named Robert Tarbox claimed that a merchant mariner had come into him for help in the early 1970s, and then confessed to being the Zodiac. Tarbox, who had since been disbarred by the California Supreme Court for failing to pay his own clients, said that he could not reveal the name of the seaman, but that the young man's description of the crimes convinced him. Tarbox said that the young man was trying to stop before he lashed out again, but after making an appointment, the young man never came back to see him. Eventually, Robert Tarbox took out a full-page ad in the Vallejo Times-Herald in an effort to clear the name of Arthur Lee Allen. Robert Graysmith, who had spent years trying to point to Allen as the Zodiac Killer, even described Tarbox's story as quote-unquote entirely plausible. Tarbox has never revealed the name of this merchant mariner, and nothing has come of this alleged confession. Steve Hodel, a detective turned author who wrote the book Black Dahlia Avenger, has made allegations that his own father, George Hodel, was the Zodiac. In his original novel, he theorized that his father was the killer behind the Black Dahlia, and he made similar allegations about the Zodiac crimes based on his father's handwriting. He also says that his father matches the description of the Zodiac killer, but again, nothing has come of this allegation. This constant stream of suspects has continued even to the last few years. Just a couple of years ago, a man named Randy Cheney came forward to announce that his friend, Louis Joseph Myers, had confessed to him twice about being the Zodiac. Once in the 1970s, and then again in 2001, when Myers was dying from cirrhosis of the liver. For what it's worth, it seems that Myers had a personal connection to some of the crimes. He attended the same high schools as David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and even allegedly worked in the same restaurant as Darlene Ferrin. Also, he had access to the same kind of boot found at the Lake Berryessa crime scene, due to his military service. In fact, between 1971 and 1973, when the Zodiac stopped corresponding with the media, Myers was stationed overseas in Germany. As I said just a moment ago, Myers died in 2001 and allegedly confessed to his friend, Randy Cheney. He wanted the other man to come forward with this information after his death. When he was asked by his friend why he had gone through the effort to kill all of these people, Myers said he had done so because of a bad breakup with an old girlfriend. Despite the circumstantial evidence pointing towards Myers, police have not indicated that he has ever been considered a serious suspect. Another suspect developed primarily over the internet by Tom Voigt and the rest of the researchers at ZodiacKiller.com was a man named Richard Joseph Gaikowski. Richard Gaikowski was born in 1936 and was drafted into the United States Army. He served as a medic before leaving the service and moving to the Bay Area. He lived in Martinez for a time, nearby Vallejo, and began working for Good Times, a San Francisco counterculture newspaper. In addition to resembling the composite sketch of the Zodiac, he also seemed to have a close personal relationship with Darlene Ferrin. In fact, he happened to move to New York at around the same time as Darlene, and worked in the same building as her first husband, James Crabtree. Crabtree worked for the Times-Union newspaper, while Gaikowski worked for the rival Knickerbocker News. He then moved back to the Bay Area at around the same time as Darlene, and lived in California until his death from lung cancer in 2004. Nancy Slover, the Vallejo police dispatcher who received a call from the Zodiac shortly after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, listened to recordings of Gaikowski's voice and identified him as the same man she had heard all of those years before. However, many point out that it had been decades since Slover had heard from the Zodiac, so that's hardly definitive proof. Plus, Gaikowski seemed to have documented some out-of-country travel for the time period of at least one of the Zodiac attacks, which would rule him out as a suspect entirely, just like all of the other leads. Richard Gaikowski's name has gotten nowhere in the Zodiac case. Another lead developed by web sleuths centers around a mysterious man named Watterson, a profile that ZodiacKiller.com has been working on since December of 2017. This man, who was a commercial airline pilot, had ties to multiple locations from the Zodiac case. He resided at Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California, and his wife attended both high school and college in Vallejo. When he divorced from his wife, at around the same time that the Zodiac began striking, he often took his children to Lake Berryessa for day trips. Watterson also seemed to have a history of violence, which was found by these web sleuths during some document digging. It was discovered that his wife originally tried filing for divorce in 1964, citing mental cruelty, before the two reconciled. They would stay together until 1969, when they officially divorced. At the time of their first marriage speed bump, in September of 1964, Watterson was questioned by police after a woman was abducted near Sahara, Tahoe. The woman wasn't killed, but this location alone would point to another one of the crimes Zodiac alleged to have involvement in, the disappearance of Donna Loss from Lake Tahoe. Watterson also happened to later live in Los Angeles, at around the same time that the Zodiac sent his letter to the LA Times in 1971. This suspect bore a strong physical resemblance to the eyewitness sketches, standing 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighing in at around 190 pounds, with a stocky build and a military-style haircut. This lead is still being actively developed, so there isn't much more to say about it until more details surface, but it's something at least. One final theory that I've seen used primarily on the internet is the theory that the killings perpetrated by the Zodiac were themselves unrelated. This theory hinges on the idea that one man, or a collection of several people, tried to take credit for the various attacks in an effort to cause confusion and chaos within law enforcement and the Bay Area community. This theory seems to be partially pushed by a man named Tom Horan, who published a book based on this subject, titled The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1969. Horan believes that the entire Zodiac case was created by someone who wanted to connect various crimes for the publicity, and to inspire panic. Without getting too preachy or nitpicky, this is not a theory that I agree with. Namely, because this theory tries to argue the basic facts of the case as multiple police jurisdictions and the FBI have come to understand them. In fact, many of the law enforcement agencies who have handled the Zodiac case dismiss this theory offhand because it has no root in reality. What we know about the Zodiac hinges on some important pieces of information. First, that the two crimes, the Lake Herman Road murders of 1968 and the Blue Rock Springs attack of 1969, were linked because the killer provided police and media with details that only the perpetrator would know. These were details that were not published by the media at the time, so they would have only been known by the detectives that handled the case and the culprit himself. Then, following the Lake Berryessa attack, the killer left behind his handwriting on the side of Brian Hartnell's white Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. That writing has been confirmed to match the Zodiac letters, which we now know contain insider information that only the killer would know. Then, following the murder of Paul Stine in Presidio Heights, the same letter writer, who called himself the Zodiac, mailed pieces of Stine's bloody shirt to the San Francisco Chronicle and attorney Melvin Belli. Unless the forensic evidence was wrong, which confirmed the shirt as belonging to Paul Stine, then I don't see how that can be faked. So, at the very least, we have 4 connected crimes belonging to one Zodiac killer. 4 crimes linked through heartache and tragedy, where forensic testing, expert handwriting analysis, and almost impossible to know details linked them all together. From there, it is fair to argue whether or not any of the possibly related crimes hold any connection. This includes the Riverside murder of Sherry Jo Bates, the disappearance of Donna Loss, etc. But the idea that the 4 crimes linked to the Zodiac were perpetrated by a genius mastermind that was able to learn details about crimes without actually being there, participate in the letter-writing process in a time before computing existed, and mail pieces of Paul Stine's bloody shirt is just silly to me. In fact, I almost find it offensive, on behalf of the various figures that have dedicated months and years of their lives to investigating the Zodiac case for law enforcement. That's why I personally get a little bit heated and dismiss the Zodiac hoax theory without a second thought. Countless people have come forward to allege that someone they know, a friend, a family member, a neighbor, a co-worker, harbored a secret. Some secret so massive that it may finally solve America's most infamous cold case. It seems like most of the time, these people are pushing something, and they try to twist the facts to fit their own personalized theory. In my opinion, this only tarnishes the hard work that investigators have dedicated their lives to, and it has done nothing more than contribute to a story that is already confusing, and crowded with facts, details, timelines, and a cavalcade of suspects, each more terrifying than the last. Nowadays, the Zodiac exists in the American zeitgeist, not as a perpetrator of violent acts, but as more of a myth, an urban legend. Every so often, you hear about these allegations being made by an aspiring author or documentarian, and it triggers discussions of the Zodiac once again. Every now and then, a joke or a meme will even bring life back into the tale of the Zodiac killer, such as the idea that Ted Cruz is the Zodiac. In February of 2011, America's Most Wanted helped trigger one of these momentary relapses in the public consciousness, when, in their broadcast, they included a picture that had surfaced the year before. The picture shows Zodiac murder victim Darlene Ferrin standing next to an innocuous-looking young man. He's pretty handsome, has dark hair, glasses, and happens to look pretty similar to the suspect sketches of the Zodiac killer. This man has become known as the quote-unquote unknown man, in some Zodiac web sleuth circles, because nobody has been able to pinpoint his identity. Not police, not the media, not even the internet commenters who have dedicated their free time in trying to solve pieces of the Zodiac puzzle. The unknown man remains frozen in time, in a picture that authorities believe was taken in San Francisco in either 1966 or 1967. I only mention this because the odds of capturing the Zodiac alive are basically slim to none. The Zodiac was described as being around 30 years old back in 1969, which would make him right around 80 years old today, if not older. It's most likely that he's passed on, and took his secrets to the grave. But thanks to forensic testing, truth and justice have been given a second lease on life.
The Zodiac Killer is responsible for at least 5 murders in the late 60s and early 70s. Tonight, the case that was considered all but unsolvable may have new legs.
The case of the Golden State Killer is sparking new hope this morning that other Bay Area cold cases could be solved, and that includes the notorious Zodiac killings.
And people are now trying to trace DNA in hopes that it will lead them to a suspect.
Several months ago, Vallejo police sent envelopes from the Zodiac Killer to a DNA lab for testing. Investigators hope to obtain a full DNA profile from saliva on the envelopes and stamps.
The Sacramento Bee reports that Vallejo police have submitted letters and envelopes from the Zodiac Killer to a private lab to obtain a DNA profile. The hope that those envelopes he licked closed years ago might be the final piece to crack the case.
Police do think that he is dead, but they still want to find out for sure who he was. And they say police agencies from San Francisco to Vallejo to Napa, they're all still working together and are committed to closing this case. Now they're even turning to non-traditional techniques to try and get this job done.
Utilizing the same DNA testing methods that led to the arrest of the Golden State Killer, authorities are hoping that they'll be able to track down the infamous Zodiac. Now, this process is pretty thorough and complicated, but at the moment, experts are trying to use innovative new ways to obtain DNA from evidence. The hope is that they'll be able to get DNA from the underside of the stamps used in the Zodiac's correspondence. This is a pretty ingenious way to try and track down the infamous killer, as it's utilizing new technology which separates the potential killer's DNA from the glue that is used in postage stamps. From there, investigators are hoping to use the same type of DNA testing that nabbed the Golden State Killer, also known as the original Night Stalker and the East Area Rapist. But they're currently focusing on the task at hand, and that current step requires patience, innovation, and will undoubtedly rely on the evidence storage procedures used by law enforcement throughout the years. The FBI has revealed, due to information redacted from public records, that there are Zodiac letters and much more information that has not been released to the public. Only time will tell whether or not that information gets released. One can only hope that the innovative new DNA techniques will be able to track down the Zodiac after all these years. Until that happens, the stories of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Mike Mageau, Cecilia Shepard, Brian Hartnell, Paul Stein, and everyone else whose life was taken over or consumed by the mysterious Zodiac remain unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I truly hope that you enjoyed this series on the Zodiac and found it at least as entertaining or as informative as I did. The Zodiac was the case that got me interested in true crime so many years ago, so it was a bit of wish fulfillment for myself, getting to cover it on my own mystery podcast. Before I go, I just want to throw out a brief thank you to everyone that has helped release details about the Zodiac over the years. Everyone from Robert Graysmith to my buddy Morph over at the Criminology podcast. If you think that this thank you applies to you, it does. Thank you. If you would like to follow along with the podcast, make sure to subscribe on your podcast app of choice, if you haven't already. And then follow that up with a kind rating and review if you're feeling up to it. If you want to follow along with podcast updates and more on social media, you could follow or like our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. Just look for Unresolved Pod, and it should pop up and be pretty easy to find. If you would like to send in an email, you could do so by sending in your emails to theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com, unresolvedpod@gmail.com, or you could send them in to me personally at micheal@unresolved.me. That's Micheal @unresolved.me. If you want to send in a text message or leave a voicemail, you could do so by hitting up the podcast phone line at 831-200-3550. Once again, that's 831-200-3550. And, of course, you could find all of this information on the podcast website, which is unresolved.me. One more time, that's unresolved.me. Now, I don't quite know which story I'll be focusing on the next episode, but I do not anticipate there being a long gap of silence between this one and that one. So hopefully you'll be hearing from me again next week. Until then, everyone, stay tuned, stay safe, and I'll talk to you all later.